Now, this may come as zero surprise to any of the regular listeners of What Magic Is This? But I love books. I love reading them. I love holding them. I love turning the pages. The written word to me is about as close as I have to something that is sacrosanct. Some days I certainly do feel that I have to rein it in a little bit and make sure that I'm not overly fetishizing them. But it still must be said that in my experience, so much of my knowledge has come from books, and it is something that I want to share with other people, particularly through things like my show notes. Hey, you like this topic? You gotta read this book. Now, books and magic, that's a wonderful combination. Those two go together like, ketchup and chips. It's just a wonderful combination, and I would say that the vast majority of my knowledge, my magical knowledge, has come from books, not so much from, learning from a teacher or anything like that. I'll read about it and then I'll give it a shot and I'll try it. But something happened in my magical journey over the last 10 years where I began to stop taking contemporary magicians at their word, at their written word through the books that they would release. I stopped looking at magic from within and really began to look at the history of ritual magic and occultism from outside of it. And guess what I found? The Western ritual magic tradition is pretty much grimoires. Well, let me explain. Not the books themselves, but what they reveal to us. Grimoires are the evidence that some kind of ritual magic tradition existed through all strata of society, that they were attempting to, for the most part, interact with spirits, angels, and much more. But what could be better? That the archaeological artifacts that we have to some kind of Western ritual magic tradition should be books. This realization has just informed almost every bit of my magic going forward once I came to this conclusion. And why not, right? The trope of a book of magic that has some kind of secret power or reveals some kind of way of interacting with otherworldly or sublunar entities is rife through all forms of storytelling, be they books themselves, films, TV shows, all of it. Yet these things are real, and we have them, and we can look at them, and we can study them. Now, the term grimoire only became synonymous with book of magic in the 18th century, and one of the major reasons for this was because they were difficult to read. Sometimes this was on purpose, but if you get a translated grimoire these days and you put it in front of you and you flip through it, this still holds true. These things are a little bit difficult to go through. No fear though, I am here to help, and I actually have fun reading them. And hopefully, in this show, once you're done taking in all of this information, you will too. So my name is Douglas Batchelor, and this is What Magic Is This? A podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. And in this one, I'm going to take you through how to read grimoires. I would like you to do me a favor, and there's no ploy here. It's not for me trying to bump up my website traffic numbers or anything like that, but I want you to listen to what I'm going to say here, and then I want you to go and do it. So go to whatmagicisthis.com, find the episode How to Read Grimoires, go to the show notes, and the second show note there should be the Folger VB26 manuscript. And I want you to just flip through it, scroll through it. I just want you to take a look at an actual historical grimoire from the 16th century. And I want you to take note of what it makes you feel Does it make you excited in some way? Does it make you feel like a little bit confused? You don't understand the language, surely, but you can see these strange diagrams and circles and these odd flourishes, which this grimoire has plenty of. The writing of this grimoire and the little marginalia in there is really quite fantastic. But I want you to take note of what is going on when you look at an actual 16th century ritual magician's notebook. Are you kind of bored by it? This is like, okay, I don't get what Doug's trying to instill here, but give yourself about 15 minutes of looking at an actual grimoire manuscript, and then come on back to me. Because I just want you to see these things. A lot of people, they don't actually look at the scans of these books themselves. But what they are seeing is the evidence of the Western ritual magic tradition. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? That we could have these manuscripts, and there's a lot of them. Truthfully, there's tons of them. And I think that the sheer amount of them goes against this idea that this was just like a LARP, that this was, just people creating these odd books and then they just have them around and be like, oh, look how scary and sorcerous I am. I don't think that that's true. These documents, whether you like it or not, these documents are our heritage. I know I'm laying it on a bit thick right now, and bear with me, but this is one of the whys as to why I am making this episode. If I sound like a broken record, and I have said this many times on this show, that I believe magic is real. I believe it in my soul and in my bones, in everything. It informs everything that I do, and so it deserves a real and true history. So many folks buy supposed books of magic written by contemporary authors and magicians that are basically asking you to do a step-by-step process. You do this, and then you visualize some crap, and then you're a magician. I don't know about you, but I find these extremely boring, for the most part at least. And so I am asking you to find yourself and go through real historic documents of magic. You might be shocked at how much you learn. But again, if you don't have the proper foundation as to how to think to read these things, it's going to be initially extremely frustrating. But magic isn't easy. And to my mind, nothing like what I am about to do in this episode exists until now. It's not going to be as hard as you think it is. It's just going to be an episode where I will take you through some things to keep in mind and perhaps a couple of tips, and I'll even suggest some grimoires. Yep, there's going to be some book recommendations towards the end of the episode. That's the hook. You see what I did? Got to have a hook. So that's the hook. I'm going to do what I've never done before. I'm going to suggest some books. So that's what this episode will be. What this episode will not be is hand-holding and telling you what you can do, what you can't do. I'm not going to take you through the entire process of how to have a conversation with an angel or how to summon an infernal spirit. That is not what this episode is for. I am sticking to the books themselves. No doubt some of those questions that you have about summoning and evoking and stuff will be answered in due time. Be patient. We'll get there. But yes, if you're looking for the protocols and the process of how to do something like Solomonic magic, that is not this episode. Also, if you're looking for a history of grimoires and who was using grimoires, that's not in this episode either. I have done a full episode about grimoires with the inestimable Dr. Alexander Cummins. Please check that episode out. Hopefully some of the questions that you have will be answered there. Or you could just read Grimoires, A History of Magic Books by the academic Owen Davies. It is a brilliant book, highly, highly recommended. Did I just give a book recommendation at the beginning of this episode? Fuck! My hook is gone. Just kidding. You're gonna hang around anyways. I know you will. Okay then, preamble finished. That's about 10 minutes of me just talking. Let us crack the spine on this one and get started. So, what is The biggest thing that I want people to understand about grimoires before they even pick up a translation or even go to esotericarchives.com to look at some of these grimoires and read them online, before any of that, what I need you to understand is this. The trick to reading and utilizing grimoires is in the name. The word grimoire comes from the same word that we have as grammar. A grimoire is, in a way, a grammar. In the same way that a book of grammar nowadays will tell you what words you should be able to use and how to use them, so that if you were to use the grammar of the language specifically, you'll be able to communicate properly. If you follow these rules, communication possible. If not, not possible is there. A grimoire, at least the ones that we really try to pay attention to, isn't just a collection of spells. Some of them are, but for the most part, they should have a methodology. They have their own rules and way of trying to explain to you that by using these rules, when you do these rituals and you go through these spells, magic will happen. And yet, if you were to say pick up a book of grammar from the 16th century, you will notice that the rules have changed quite a bit to where we are now for speaking. And that is because of evolution and getting rid of things that are no longer useful and adding things to augment the language itself. And this comes through a process of trial and error and experimentation, the very things that magicians need to do to carry their magic forward. So we are given through grimoires the grammar, a snapshot of a methodology for a kind of magic, and it usually has to do with spirit interactions. And yes, they are specific to the time in which they were composed. But what is wonderful about this is that we can go back and see through all of the history of these documents that we have that there is some kind of an evolution. So while the grimoires can say things like, you have to do this, 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 and this, you don't. What you are looking at is a point of magical history wherein somebody is sharing a methodology and a method of ritual and magic. They're sharing a grammar. So this needs to be kept in mind. For a lot of these documents, there is a methodology and a grammar to them. Figuring out what is what? Well, that's what I'm here to help with. One thing I would advise before you really get cracking on these things is the authorship conundrum. Now, if it is interesting to you, this is definitely something to circle back on, but trying to figure out who exactly wrote these documents is very difficult. A lot of times they are attributed to people that certainly did not write them. Peter de Abano is a name. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, done an episode about him. His name gets put on a lot of grimoires. Roger Bacon, figures which may or may not have existed, like St. Cyprian of Antioch, and even figures from folktales or lore, like Faust. Apparently they've written grimoires. Some of these documents we certainly do know who wrote them, but a lot of them we do not. I get the impulse to want to try and find the author of these things, a name, say, like Dr. Rudd. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Who is this enigmatic Dr. Rudd? The Goetia of Dr. Rudd. Who is he? Who could this possibly be? And then once you head down that rabbit hole, you find that there might be 3 Dr. Rudds. It might be a pseudonym for somebody else by the name of Peter Smart. Anyways, if authorship is interesting to you, swing back to it after you've gotten a handle of these things a bit more. There was a reason that the authors or the people transcribing other grimoires to release their own grimoire didn't want to have their name on it. It has something to do with death. Alright, kidding aside, I've done a lot of talking about the fact that a grimoire is just a grammar and a lot of them have a methodology and a method, but I want people to understand also that it doesn't mean that grimoires have the same methodology behind each and every one of them. Grimoires, for the most part, again, they just mean a book of magic and something that's kind of a little bit hard to make sense of. And so they can run the gamut through all kinds of content that is in them. And you're not going to know right away what kind of grimoire you're going to get just from looking at the cover of any of these things that have been translated. But for the most part, the ones that we tend to define as a grimoire as opposed to just a book of spells is because, yes, they do have some kind of a methodology to them. When people will be like, oh, the Greek magical papyri in translation edited by Hans-Dieter Betz, that's a grimoire. It's not really a grimoire because it doesn't have an underlying methodology to it. And it's also just a collection of a whole bunch of papyri, a bunch of spells that they have nothing in common. And there's even things in there that are just kind of put there because the editor who translated and released the Greek magical papyri back in the 80s, you just put it in there, right? That being said, there are some grimoires that are just a whole bunch of crazy spells and stuff. No real ritual structure to it. So I guess we can kind of consider those grimoires as well. A good way of trying to get a handle on what I'm trying to say here is through pretty much the most notorious grimoire that we have. It's a kind of grimoire, and this name might come up. You might have heard it every once in a while on my show or elsewhere, but it's called a clavicula or the Clavicula Salomonis. That name is applied to a certain kind of grimoire which has a shape. And I will touch on the shape of this grimoire in a little bit. But I just want people to know that there are well over 100 of these things in collections, both private and public. And they are written in, well, English, French, German, Hebrew, Italian, Dutch, Latin. There's even one in Czech. The oldest known copy of the Key of Solomon, or a clavicula, comes basically from 1466. So that's the 15th century. And most people, most scholars kind of put the cap on claviculas when MacGregor Mathers, one of the founders of the Golden Dawn, released his Key of Solomon in the late 19th century. But the point I'm trying to make here is that as far as kinds of grimoires, the Key of Solomon is up at the top. It is the most renowned grimoire that we have. And of course, when you look at these documents, they have the same kind of shape, but that does not mean that they have the same kind of things in them. And the shape of a Solomonic grimoire or a clavicula is, well, first of all, it involves the mythology or the history of Solomon. King Solomon, the son of David, monarch of ancient Israel in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, builder of Solomon's temple in ancient Israel. The story goes that Solomon was able to enlist the help of spirits in order to build his temple, and that he had power to get these spirits to do his bidding. And so you, as a magician, if you follow the words or the Key of Solomon, you too can do this. For the most part, claviculas tend to have most of these elements within them, so that is how we can designate them as a clavicula or a Key of Solomon. The first is that it usually starts with Solomon addressing his son, Rehoboam, and basically telling him, this is what I know. If you do these things, you can have my powers. In this case, you, the one reading the grimoire, or the person transcribing it, takes the place of Solomon's son. They usually have timing concerning days, hours, and planetary virtues, prayers and conjurations, talismans and pentacles, and how one is supposed to construct these, astrological considerations, tools and tool construction, garments and what to wear when you were doing any number of the rituals in the Keys of Solomon. And they normally have a sequence of operations in which one can undergo this work. So if they have most of those things, and it tends to be somewhat similar to earlier keys of Solomon or the claviculas, chances are it's a clavicula. But here's the thing. Sometimes things say they're a key of Solomon, and they just aren't. But you have to understand that this is only one kind of grimoire, and it is one that, although definitely the most popular, is not indicative of every single grimoire that we have. There are grimoires that just seem like this strange collection of spells, and a little bit tucked in there is like a bit of timing and some circles, but the rest is just some kind of a miscellany, a magical miscellanea. There are grimoires that read almost like a story, and they're trying to tell you certain spells and rituals, but in a story-based way. And while indeed we do have a type of grimoire called a clavicula or a key of Solomon, most grimoires that don't fall into this category don't really have a designation. There's something you might come across called a thesaurus spiritum or a treasury of spirits, which for the longest time completely confused me, and I came off like a bit of a magical noob to Dr. Alexander Cummins when I reached out to him. I was like, I'm trying to find the manuscript number for the Thesaurus Spiritum, and he's like, that's not a specific grimoire, that's a whole kind of grimoire, a type of grimoire. And yes, I did do that. Anyways, it happens as you're trying to understand these things. But you might very well come across something called Bibliothèque Bleue or blue grimoires. And those are a type of grimoire, not because of the contents within them specifically, but in how they were produced. Blue grimoires were basically small chapbooks, mass-produced chapbooks, and they were hugely popular. And the reason they're called Bibliothèque Bleue or blue grimoires is because for the most part, the covers would be paper and they would be blue. It was blue paper. My point in going through all of this is that for the most part, the grimoire type or format of the clavicula or the key of Solomon is the one that most academics or people that study grimoires tend to focus on because it has a very structured and set methodology to it. It is, in a way, a complete grammar of ritual magic. So while it's all well and good that we have such thing called a clavicula, when you go trying to seek out other specific kinds of grimoires, things get a little bit confusing. I would say, for the most part, confront a grimoire or a translation of a grimoire on its own terms. If the translator mentions a specific kind of grimoire, this is a clavicula, then you're like, oh, okay, I know why that is a clavicula. If they say something like, this is a blue grimoire, it's like, oh, I know how it was produced in France from like the 17th century to about the 19th century. Cool, got it. But don't let this trying to type or, categorize what kind of grimoire sets you back. Confront the grimoire on its own terms. So suffice to say, these books, for the most part, a lot of them were written by, not all of them, but a lot of them were written by people who had some kind of prestige or they had some kind of money. And then eventually, when they passed away or when their children or grandchildren passed away, eventually their book collection or their manuscript collection would be put up for auction. And there was this whole wave of antiquarianism that swept through Europe at certain points in which these things would become ridiculously popular. And then they would be bought up by individuals, or they might even make their way into collections. Things like the British Library or the British Museum. And they become part of collections. Either that or they were confiscated somehow by some inquisition or some sort. Sometimes it's interesting to know how they got into these collections, sometimes not. Take it or leave it. For myself, when I started to get into grimoires and really begin to study them in some way, this was one of my biggest headaches. And I want to say that it doesn't need to be as complex for you as I certainly made it for myself. So when you get going on this kind of stuff and you start to do a little bit of digging, and when you're looking at a specific grimoire, you're going to come across a bunch of names followed by a couple of letters followed by a number. And the names will specifically be things like Welcome or Sloan or Bibliothèque Nationale. etc., etc. And this is merely just the collections into which these manuscripts and the folios that they're a part of are housed. So the welcome just means the Welcome Collection. It was basically part of a Wellcome Trust, which was founded by Sir Henry Solomon Wellcome. Ooh, there's that name, Solomon. Crazy. Anyhow, this doesn't need to be that confusing. All it is basically telling you where these things are kept, specifically the collection where they are found. Following these names, there's usually 2 letters, and for the most part, these are going to be MS. And what they're talking about here is just specifically the manuscript. If you get a grimoire and it tells you what this is translated, that's usually going to be the major part of the grimoire. It's the manuscript. But a lot of times these manuscripts were stuffed in with other manuscripts, and I don't want to get into it too deeply because sometimes it gets a little bit complex. Specifically, if you want to know about things like families of manuscript as well as text groups. My goodness, that stuff gets very complex. But for you, if you are not coming to these things in an academic fashion, it shouldn't matter too much. I will touch on this in a little bit. There's a question that was asked, is that, are there any differences between translations? And the answer to that is absolutely. If you see earlier claviculas compared to later iterations, sometimes the difference is actually quite staggering. But I think the most egregious example of this, when a translator completely adds their own flourishes to their translation, is from the great beast himself, Aleister Crowley. His version of the Goetia is, he took a version of the Ars Goetia that I believe it was just the notes that MacGregor Mathers did, and then Crowley did his own thing with it. He added a whole bunch of crap that didn't need to be there. Then, he added the Bornless ritual, which is the headless ritual from the Greek magical papyri. If this sounds all weird and you have no idea what I'm talking about, cool, because, Crowley completely fucked the Ars Goetia, which is strange, because that's the version that everybody buys, sadly. But yes, there are many differences between translations, and it's through the claviculas particularly that you can see the differences and the minor things where they've maybe screwed something up or something like that. It's quite if that's your jam, if you want to investigate and go through and translate, I guess, different versions of the clavicula, then go for it. I don't really think that it affects the efficacy of the book being used, but in most cases, if the translator of the grimoire has done their job, they'll mention that this part is screwed up. They'll put it in the footnotes or something like that. And it's like, they didn't mean to put this here. It's a bit of a mistake. And so, most translators will probably correct it, or they'll put a little note that says, this isn't, they didn't mean to do this. The original scribe screwed up. I don't want to make too fine a point of this and keep talking about examples of when translators got involved in the things that they were translating, but another example, which is a little less outrageous than what Crowley did with his version of the Ars Goetia, would be Samuel Little MacGregor Mathers, again, one of the founders of the Golden Dawn. His Key of Solomon, his clavicula, he was using about 7 manuscripts, and with these 7 manuscripts basically coming with his complete Key of Solomon, but he actually took some stuff out. It's not a ton. People like Arthur Edward Waite, another interesting figure, but he kind of has some bad words to say about Mathers and what he took out of the Key of Solomon, which I don't necessarily agree with. And other folks like Joseph H. Peterson have talked about it as well. Yeah, he took out from the Key of Solomon some spells that had to do with love. And there was one as well, which was operations and experiments regarding hate and destruction of enemies. That's within most of the, or at least a lot of the claviculas. So that happens, right? I'm not really sure why Mathers thought he had to take out those love spells. It's very strange, but he didn't include those in his version of the clavicula. So it happens, definitely. The translators, at least back in the day, some of them would just not include some things for reasons. So it does happen, but nobody did it as bad as Aleister Crowley did for his version of the Ars Goetia. Do not buy his version of the Ars Goetia, please. These days, however, the translators, at least most of them, are trying to do it academically and less so because they're starting their own boring magical orders. But they just try to translate the complete documents that they have and the manuscripts that they have. The contemporary translators, and I'll talk about a couple that you should probably know. I've mentioned their names several times already, but we'll talk about some of the people who are doing the translating these days that are doing awesome work. All right, enough of that. The reason that you are all here is how to read grimoires. So let's talk about some tips, some things that have helped me, and hopefully they will help you. Now, I'm not going to get into the highly technical details of reading the manuscripts themselves. That's a whole other thing. I'm doing this from more of a practitioner's standpoint. So if you want to know about how to go through an actual manuscript of a grimoire, there's a wonderful video that Dr. Justin Sledge put out on his channel Esoterica on YouTube. It is a fantastic video, much more detailed than I'm going to go on here in this episode. But yeah, he takes a part of a 15th century German grimoire called the Munich Manual, otherwise known as the Munich Handbook of Necromancy, CLM 849. That is from the Bavarian State Library in Munich. Justin does a fantastic job of going through the technical details and the different kinds of scripts and how sometimes there's probably different scribes going through and adding to this manual, this Munich Manual of Demonic Magic. It's wonderful. Please go and watch that. As I said, it's very, very detailed. Justin does just a fantastic job there, and bless his heart. Yeah, I can't do any better than Justin did in that. So it will be in the show notes. Please go there and have a look at it. But again, it's covering a lot of the stuff that is it's a more academic way of looking at the grimoires. And so it's worth seeing that just to get some of the finer details on this specific manuscript. That manuscript is also, just a complete side note, it is partially available in a book that is edited by Richard Kiekeffer, which is called Forbidden Rites, a Necromancer's Manual of the 15th Century. And while Richard doesn't have the whole manuscript translated into English, the entire Latin is there. So if you read Latin, that's a great thing to have. But for most of us, we don't. So we have to use the ones that are translated into English. So what do you do if you have yourself a translated grimoire? How to start taking it apart so you can use it practically or take little bits from it and learn from the grimoire itself. Let's go through it. And once again, just to reiterate here, this is what I do. If you can find your own way of doing this kind of stuff and making it work for you, that is the best. That goes across not just reading grimoires, but doing magic in general. So this is basically me going to tell you what I do and what has helped me. It is by no means prescriptive, all right? So first things first, what I do is I get myself a notebook that is different than, say, like a Liber Spiritum, which is what I will use when I am actually using the grimoire for a practical purpose. When I'm doing the work of the grimoire, I'm actually doing the magic and the rituals and the spells within them. That is a Liber Spiritum. But I do cover it, Liber Spiritums, for a bit on the show that I did with Reverend Eric on Agrippa's fourth book of occult philosophy. But I just have a book of books. You can call it whatever you like. You can call it Liber if that's your jam, which is just book. Anyways, call it whatever you want. But it is a book in which I will put my notes about the grimoire and other such things. So it just makes it easier for me. It's a place where I can have everything about the grimoire outside of the grimoire, so I don't muck the grimoire up with a bunch of like notes and stickies and things like that. I like to keep my grimoire somewhat clean and then just refer to my notebook and, make it look cool, make it look good. You can even get yourself a What Magic Is This notebook from the merch store. Just saying. They're really cool. They've got designs. One's got a skull on it. It's great. Anyways, but yes, I will just have a notebook in which to put, notes about that grimoire. If you want to do it all online, make a Word document or a Google document or anything like that, by all means, go for it. I just like having, again, to go back to the beginning of this episode, I just like having books in my hand. Feels magical. So I have my notebook and I have the grimoire and I'm using them together. I will make a space in the notebook for each grimoire. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I am going to write down the name of the grimoire. Now, here's the thing. Grimoires, sometimes they have a lot of names and it can get very confusing and it's weird because remember I was talking about how the Munich Manual is also called the Munich Handbook of Necromancy. So that's like 2 names for one document, but I will try to write down as many names as I can for that, for the specific grimoire that I have in my hands. An example I will use for this one is a book that you can go out and buy, and I will talk about it in a little bit. It is translated by Joseph H. Peterson. It is called The Secrets of Solomon, or The Art Rabidmadar, or The Ars Rabidmadar, or Clavicula Solomonis de Secretis, or De Secretis. All of these names are used interchangeably with this specific grimoire. And so it gets confusing. I write down every single one of those names underneath the title of this grimoire that I have in my hands that goes in the notebook. So I know when people are talking about it on, say, things like a Glitch Bottle, great example, Glitch Bottle podcast, one of my favorite podcasts. A lot of people on there talking about a lot of grimoires. And so when they mention something, they'll just say, oh, De Secretis or the Rabidmadar. I'm like, Rabidmadar? What? Oh, okay. So they're talking about these manuscripts, which were translated into one grimoire by Joseph H. Peterson. Got it. It's just to keep things all nice and tidy because a lot of these things have a lot of different names and it certainly gets very confusing. Write down all of the names. And it's strange how they get these names, particularly when folks talk about them in an informal fashion, non-academically, because they can have a lot of nicknames. They can have a lot of alternate titles. So it just gets, it gets a bit messy, but you're there with the notebook to make sure it's all nice and tidy. And so underneath all of the names that I can discern from the translated grimoire, beneath that, I will make a note of all of the manuscripts that were used to create this translated grimoire. Sometimes it's just one straight up manuscript. It'll be something like Harley MS 6483. But it could also be several manuscripts. And usually the translators will mention what parts of what they've included in the translation are from what manuscripts. I just write them all down and then I make a little note next to it. So it'll be like, oh, okay, this is this part of this grimoire. And that's just good to have to cross-reference because a lot of times when people talk, they're going to mention the manuscript numbers, particularly if they're of the more academic bent. And you can be like, oh, okay, I have that written down. I can see that that is what they're talking about. Oh, they're talking about this part of this grimoire or that section of this translated grimoire. It just keeps things nice and tidy. I don't normally include like, so CLM 849, that's in the Bavarian State Library. I don't really do that too much. That's not as important to me where these things are kept, but I do like to have the manuscript listing name and number there because, yes, people, when they talk about these things, a lot of times they will talk about them using the manuscript number. And so that just makes things really easy. And again, yes, just to reiterate, some of these grimoires and that one that I just mentioned, The Secrets of Solomon, that uses a lot of sources. So it goes through like a lot of manuscripts in different places. So it does get a little bit confusing. And just so I have the names of where all the manuscripts come from for the most part, as well as their numbers, it just helps out. Practically, it's almost of zero use as far as like involving it into my magic, but it just keeps things easy because I guarantee you, if this stuff gets interesting to you, you're going to want to listen to a lot of podcasts and you're going to want to read a lot of other books about grimoires. And they'll use the manuscript numbers and names. And they're going to talk about these manuscripts. And just so you know what they're talking about, you have to be specific. Gets so confusing. It really does. Just make it easier on yourself. Write as much down as you can about being specific with each and every one of these translated grimoires. Then what I will do, and normally this comes from reading the introductions to these translated grimoires, is that they will note what kind of grimoire it might be. Now, a good example of this one is the example that I just brought up earlier, The Secrets of Solomon. Again, remember the name that I had there, the other name, Clavicula Solomonis de Secretis. Now, so you might be like, oh, it's a clavicula. Clavicula's in the title of the manuscript, so it must be a clavicula. It's got to be a Key of Solomon. Well, what's weird about this text, and if you read the introduction to the Grimoire by Joseph H. Peterson, he lets you know that it's not a clavicula in the true sense. He says, quote, "Despite the title, the text should not be considered a subclass of the many varieties of Clavicula Solomonis, the Key of Solomon texts, largely known from the 1889 edition by Samuel Little McGregor Mathers. Instead, it distinguishes itself as a supplemental clavicula or little key, focused on chthonic spirits instead of aerial spirits." End quote. So, this document, this grimoire, has more in common, say, with something like the Ars Goetia than it would, say, with something like the Key of Solomon. So I note that. I have to write that down. It's like, it says in the title it's a clavicula. It's not a clavicula. That goes in the notebook too, because I think that that's important. That is important to me because I'm addicted to these things. I love grimoires and I'm going through tons of them all the time. And so it just keeps things organized for myself. Now, I find something else that is very important is reading through the entire introduction to one of these translated grimoires, reading through it a couple of times, because the first time you read through it, it's like, oh, that's all really interesting. Cool. I'm going to get to the grimoire. And then there's some bits in there in the introduction that might have ramifications a little bit further on down the line as you read the grimoire. So I read the introduction, and then I read it again, right? And so I'm looking for specific things that might be important to keep in mind when I go through the text and translated text itself. Trust me, the introductions, I think, particularly if the translator is very good, they're important. And sometimes even they'll tell you straight up how the grimoire is to be utilized. Particularly, again, to go back to this book, The Secrets of Solomon, Joseph H. Peterson, in his introduction, he goes through every part of the grimoire. So there's about 4 books in that grimoire. And then he talks about the requirements for the magician, so the things that you might need to do as a magician if you want to use the grimoire. And then he goes through the methods, and he just lays it all out for you. It's super easy, and it's incredibly helpful. So yes, don't skip the introduction. Keep with it. Read it once, read it twice. Make the notes in your notebook. Something else that I find that helps me, myself personally, is with some of the translations, they're going to be partial translations. So they're not going to be written in the English that we use and read right now. A lot of them are, but some of them aren't. And so some of the translations are just that the words as they were written in the manuscript, they're just tidied up and rewritten in a font that we can recognize these days. So some of the words are going to be, particularly if they're from early modern England, they're going to be in that old-timey Shakespearean language that it's a bit strange and it might throw you off. So I sometimes, as I'm reading through it, I have to make notes that this word means that thing. The one that always threw me off, and to this day it still kind of throws me off, I'll give an example, is that I would be reading through one of these translations that was just a partial translation, and then I would get to a word and it would throw me completely off. And that word, as we read it these days, is divers. Divers. I was like, divers? Who's going scuba diving while they're doing magic? Divers, back in the day, that was diverse. They're talking about the word diverse, but it's spelled in this translation because they're just going off of the way that it was written in the manuscript. It was spelled D-I-V-E-R-S, not D-I-V-E-R-S-E. And still to this day, it trips me up. Every time divers, Okay, bring your aqualung. So I will make note of some of the words that are a little bit tricky, and just writing them down helps my brain recognize. I wasn't the greatest student, and so this stuff kind of takes me time. So if there's some of these words which are a little bit weird to my mind and to my eye, I will just write them down. And then the act of me writing them down helps me to be able to read it and not get too log jammed. Just another note about those partially translated grimoires, and particularly it happens for those ones that were written in early modern England. It is advisable to take them in little chunks, to try and read those things from cover to cover. It's a bit difficult, or at least I find it difficult. And even though these people don't realize, a lot of these grimoires, they're short. They're not very long, right? We have this idea that there's these giant tomes and books that are grimoire magic. Most grimoires are not big. They're pretty small. But even still, if it's just a partial translation, I will read 3 or 4 paragraphs or just like a specific spell or ritual, and then I'll give myself a break, or else my brain's going to explode. It's tough to read sometimes. Some of them are just, the way that we used to write was awesome in a way, but it was our mind these days, and particularly, I can only speak for myself, it seems very odd, but that was just what they did. So take note of that as well. So if you do have a manuscript that's only partially translated into English, just make a note like, well, maybe you just read this in little bits. And if there's a part of it that you really want to get for use later on to use as a ritual, I would suggest writing it down so that you can understand it. And truthfully, that is something that I would put into my Liber Spiritum, because if I get jammed up when I'm doing the ritual itself, if I get a bit confused, I'm like, while I'm doing the spell or the ritual, that doesn't help what you're doing. It does not help the magician to stumble over their words. So just write it out in your Liber Spiritum. If you want to use it, write it out the way that you would read it. Trust me, you don't have to have all of the oldie English inflections. I don't think that really matters when you're doing these rituals. And that's just me. Others would argue, because that's what grimoire magicians tend to do. Man, they love arguing. So once you have all of the preliminary information, titles, manuscript number, what language, all of that stuff, you've read the introduction not once, but twice. And this seems very, very simple. And people will be like, Doug, what the hell are you talking about here? Why are you even saying this? But read the grimoire. Make your way through the actual grimoire itself from front to back, okay? And what you will find a lot of times when you're reading these things that should, to your mind, should be at the very beginning because they're essential to the process of working the grimoire. That's just how these things were written. There are things towards the back that you think should be in the front. They're all over the place. They're written like this to be hard to read. They're workbooks for the most part. And so read the whole thing, start to finish. And then just take notes. Yeah, it's that easy. Just take notes. Be like, oh, okay, so the tool construction, that's a little bit further towards the back. I make a little note of that. And then, it says that here's the timings. I should probably put that close to the front. What page are the timings on? Okay, I've written that in my notebook just so I know. I can put a little bookmark in the grimoire if I have it in front of me. All good there. But yeah, these things, they're not written as the whole, like, do this, then this, then this. Some are, but not all of them. And a lot of them are all over the place, but I just make notes of everything that is essential with the knowledge that I have usually from the introduction in these translated grimoires. And yeah, it starts to come together pretty quickly, and particularly if you're doing your note-taking very well. So as mentioned, there is usually to a lot of these grimoires, not all of them, but there usually is a methodology to them. The things that you want to pay attention particularly for a lot of these grimoires are things like timings, whether that has to be astrological or not. Please take note in your notebook of timings as well as consecrations and tool construction. That stuff is worth noting as well. The preliminaries that need to occur to do a lot of the ritual work in these grimoires, all of those, you should probably make note of them and what pages they occur in the translated grimoire. And that's you really have to take note of that kind of stuff. Some of them are fairly blatant and easy to follow, but not all the time. But there's something I do want to bring up, and this harkens back to the introduction to this episode. It's the Western ritual magic tradition, and for the most part, that is the evocation of spirits and angels and things of that nature. And so when people get the grimoires, yes, there's going to be, maybe in some of them, lists of spirits, and it will have a way to evoke these spirits or these demons sometimes. Yes, even demons. And so you have to keep in mind certain things. And now there is something that is considered the sequence in which to do evocation. And it's been talked about by Dr. Stephen Skinner, but for the most part, it's taken from a document called On Magical Ceremonies, which is in the 4th book of occult philosophy. I'm not going to get into whether or not it was actually written by Agrippa. Chances are it wasn't, but it might have been written by one of his students or things like that. And the sequence of evocation that it goes through in that are the consecratio Dei, the invocatio, the constrictio, the legatio, and the licentia. And so that, in short, it's a little bit complex, but that, in short, are consecrations, invocations, constraints, or the reception of the spirit, the legatio, that is the binding of the spirit, and the licentia, which is the license to depart. Now, some of the grimoires that are about evocation of these spirits, it's not going to have all of these things. But if you understand what these things are, and Stephen Skinner goes through them in the Goetia of Dr. Rudd, if you have that since I talked about it in my Goetia episode, if you know what those are and you can indicate whether they are actually there in the grimoire that you're going through, that is very, very important. But don't get hung up if all of those are not in there. I will touch on this in a little bit. But yes, these things, timing, consecrations, preliminaries, clothes you need to wear, seals you need to draw, things you need to wear on your body to protect yourself, the circles, all of that kind of stuff. Just make note of them all as much as you can in the notebook and note the pages in which they occur. And if you need to, just to be somewhat more blatant about it, you can actually just, what I do for some grimoires is I'll be like, this is how things have to operate. And I'll just make little notes in the notebook as to like step 1, step 2, step 3, the pages that these occur on, just so I know what's up. I will also make note of things that perhaps this grimoire particularly does not have in it. So say if I'd want to use a grimoire for some kind of spirit evocation and it does not have a license to depart listed there, what am I going to do about that? It's not in the grimoire. What should I do? I'll make mention. I'll write it down. It's like, it does not have a licentia. So what to do about it? Please remember, though, that I'm talking about a specific kind of grimoire for the most part. Not all grimoires are going to be about the evocation of spirits. A lot of them are, but not all of them. It's going to get covered in an upcoming episode, but there's other ways of doing an evocatory process from a grimoire. It doesn't have to be the way that it's done in On Magical Ceremonies. Breathe. Again, this stuff, it's not prescriptive in any way, but that's just a way of being able to see that evocatory process. Does the grimoire that I'm planning on using have those things in there? It's very good to take note of it. Just a couple of quick diversions here. Again, that evocatory process, it's not completely standard, but Jake Stratton Kent, in his book, The Sworn and Sacred Grimoire, released not too long ago on Hadean Press, Jake has a different structure and process of evocation worth looking into there as well. And another thing just about these spirit lists, they are very different through different grimoires. There is nothing standard about them either, particularly the ones that people really love, like the Ars Goetia. That's the 72 infernal spirits. People love that. But those spirits kind of weave in and out through different grimoires. There's a book also released by Jake Stratton Kent called Pandemonium, in which he goes through quite a few spirit lists and just tries to extract different information and has different spellings of certain demons. And perhaps this spelling of this certain demon or infernal spirit is the same as this one. Grab that. It's wonderful. In summary, I just want to say that the notebook is there to help you. It is there to help augment where the information is in the grimoire, to make it easier for you to read and to know where certain things are, and whether or not the grimoire itself is something that you want to use. There's going to be grimoires that you'll pick up and you'll be like, man, I've always wanted to maybe try something from this. And you'll go through it and you'll be like, this is not what I'm looking for. But I have the information about it. I can talk about it as somebody asks about it. It's information that's not just for me, but perhaps I can tell it to other people. Be like, oh yeah, the Sworn Book of Honorius. I know about that. It's got this, this, and this in it. But what it doesn't have is this and this. It's also known as Liber Juratus or Liber Juratus Honorii. You've got all of this information because you've written it down. You have done the work of reading through the grimoire and being able to figure out all of the pieces and the methodology. You've learned the grammar of the grimoire. And that's an awesome thing. And I think it's very fun, but I don't think it's one of those things that one can do if they don't take notes. It's a whole process. And that speaks back to the process of grimoires themselves, right? Welcome. You're part of the tradition by doing this. You are part of the Western magical tradition with your little notebook. And what's cool about this is that if there are segments from certain grimoires that you like, you can bring that into your magic. It is, again, it opens up a whole can of worms. Grimoire magicians love arguing, but I truly do think that there are segments from certain grimoires that you might not even like this grimoire. Say something like the Grimoire of Pope Honorius, which is different than the Sworn Book of Honorius, but maybe you like a part in there. You can bring that into your magic and you can use a little bit of that segment of that grimoire without having to work the entire book. You can augment your magic with bits of these grimoires. And that's also part of the Western magical tradition. Because in a lot of cases, that's how these manuscripts, these archaeological manuscripts, the evidence that we have of the Western ritual magic tradition were made. It's right there. So if you like a part from a grimoire, but you don't like the whole grimoire, there's nothing stopping you from being able to take a chunk out of it and putting it elsewhere. Which brings me to the working or the interacting with these grimoires. And as mentioned, sometimes in these grimoires, it's not going to have the things that you want. Perhaps it doesn't have timings. So what do? Well, my answer to that is you do what they did. As mentioned earlier, sometimes these manuscripts are bundled with other manuscripts that are completely different and they seem very out of place. But that is part of the tradition. And for the most part, things like Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, you will find bits of information from that in grimoires. They'll just be pulled wholesale and stuffed in there in the grimoire. That happens all the time. It happens way more than people think it does. So that's what you should do as well. That's why I think people need to interact with these things as opposed to just getting a book of contemporary magic, because you can actually see the process and how helpful it is. And you don't have to stick to the rules. You can do what people before you did. And there's nothing wrong with that. So that is also something that is very important, is that if there is something missing, do not be afraid to take from elsewhere. If the grimoire that you're looking at doesn't have any kind of timings to it, and you want to have timings to this grimoire, use timings that are appropriate from somewhere else. Maybe go on a Facebook group or something like that and be like, hey, what do people think about me using the timings from this grimoire to use for the ritual evocation process in this grimoire? Because this one doesn't have it, but this one does. And usually there'll be some good answers there. But for the most part, I think that they do work. And you will find, again, there's nothing standard about these books. There are some things that are, but there's other things that are just not. And so the timings are going to vary wildly. I think that there's some magic in trying to figure it out. And that's part of being a magician. And this, in turn, brings me to the number one question that I get asked about grimoires and grimoire magic: substitutions. It is here that I will bring up, once again, probably one of my favorite magicians alive right now, and that is Sam Block, otherwise known as Polyphones. He has a blog that is The Digital Ambler, in which he wrote a wonderful, fantastic article that I think everybody should read. And please, I'm going to quote from this heavily. I've talked to Sam about it before. Because Sam is such a great writer and he can say these things far better than I can, but I'm going to quote him a lot here. But he had an article that he put up on his blog called On Variations from and in Grimoires. Please read it. It's not one of those things like at the beginning of this episode where I'm going to tell you to stop and then come back to me. But after you finish listening to this episode, please go and read that. It is in the show notes. It is awesome. It is probably my favorite thing that Sam has ever written. And he's written a lot. So remember what I said about a grimoire being a grammar because it has a methodology. This is what Sam has to say on that. If you were to learn Japanese from a Japanese grammar book, it would tell you how to properly and correctly conjugate verbs and adjectives, where to use the subject and topic particles, and the like. It would also indicate to you what would be incorrect language, with the warning that you will not be understood properly if you use it. All grammar books tend to work in similar ways to this. Use the rules properly as laid out and you'll be understood. Don't, and you won't. But here's the thing. People break those rules all the time, and they're understood all the same. So, in what Sam is trying to say there, particularly the very end, is this wonderful evolution that we have of language. When I say my bad, that is not proper language, but you know exactly what I'm trying to say. You understood what I am getting at. That is not a proper use of grammar, but still you got it. Sam goes on to say that, for the most part, if you're trying to use a grimoire, it is best to try and follow the text as closely as possible, so you have some kind of a baseline. But Sam goes on, and I quote, "The fundamental idea of a grammar isn't to tell you every possible correct sentence, but how to form correct sentences. Just so does a grimoire not tell you all that can be done, but shows you how to do all things by using its own grammar of magic and extending it as necessary. And when you want to innovate, improve, simplify, adapt, or otherwise depart from the grimoire for whatever reason or need that arises, you know you can compare against a baseline because you've already done what the grimoire says and can extrapolate from the grimoire from there. Remember that these grimoires were written by people who lived and breathed that magic in them. They know it works because that's what they've done and recorded as what works. This is the reason behind this is the true wisdom of true divinity, because it's gotten them there. It's just that it's their truth, and there's usually more than one way to be true." End quote. I absolutely love that, and I'm just going to cap this off here, again, because Sam says it way better than I can, with part of the last paragraph of his blog entry. And so, quote, "It's possible to deviate from the instructions and still work operations because the instructions themselves are only an example of ideal situations and case studies, and the fundamental method and methodology of a grimoire allows for making whatever improvements, adjustments, or fixes along the way to account for real-world scenarios, but no more than what's necessary. Even then, each grimoire is just a snapshot of a particular book-based magical tradition and lineage, and each snapshot we can get shows how varied the real-time, real and lived magical tradition can be. There is never one true way, but many ways to truth. It's just up to us to find them and follow them, and sometimes we can take a little detour along the way that ends up being better for us, but not for others. End quote. Please read this blog post, everybody. If you have questions about what can I substitute, again, there's nothing standard. The tradition is built around change and evolution and what works. Be part of that tradition. Do not be pedantic about it. Which, of course, leads one to an inevitable aspect of these grimoires, in that a lot of them have some fairly icky stuff in them. Icky by our standards. And I don't want to have arguments about presentism and that kind of thing in here. But what I will say is that, yes, animals in particular were seen very differently than we do now. And a lot of the ritual operations within these grimoires are cruel. I'm just going to say they're flat out cruel. There's grimoires that require you to take the head of a black cat, cut it off, and the black cat that has never seen the sunlight. Yeah. All I can say about this is that there are substitutions for these. You got to be cunning. A lot of the translations, particularly if you're getting translations from Joseph H. Peterson, he has something in there in his introduction that basically says, don't do these things. And I'm going to follow that. For the most part, you do not need to do any of these things that are very cruel. There are workarounds. Again, be part of the evolution. Things are in constant change. The only thing that doesn't change is change. Whether you think it would be better to create an effigy, a papier-mâché effigy of a certain animal, and to go through the process that way, that is a substitution that is worthy. And there are certain things that you can do to, in some way, bring these things to life. Again, another reason why animism is perhaps the baseline magical framework in which to work. And yes, they for the most part, if you do it well, if you're cunning and you're sincere, they will work. The world is a cruel place already. You do not need to add to it. I'll just say that. So a few more things to keep in mind as you go through these grimoires, and you will notice them for the most part. And I just want to go through these just because these are the kind of questions that rise to the top when you're looking at grimoires. And the first one is the belief system that is attached to a lot of these grimoires. Not all of them, but a lot of them. They seem to be Abrahamic in a way. So that's going to be Christian, Jewish, or Islamic. But I will say for the most part, a lot of the ones that are translated and that you can go out and buy, those are going to be Christian. And particularly, they're going to be Catholic. Folks really have a hard time with this, and I understand why. This is not the place to discuss what can happen, but some people say, like, can you take the magic of the grimoires and substitute the names of, say, Greek gods or pagan gods in there? And while I just had a whole segment about substitutions, the short answer to this is yes, you can try. But here's another thing to keep in mind is that one has to understand the ecosystem into which this tradition and these manuscripts came to life. And you have to understand that, just as Sam said, that this is how they work. We have the snapshot of how they were supposed to work. So you have to understand that while you can try shifting out names and stuff like that, I don't know if it's going to work the way that you want to do. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you want to take the methodology from these grimoires and craft something yourself, give it a shot, right? But I would say that the belief system is part of how these books and these manuscripts came to be. To separate them out and apply something else to them, I think is deleterious to their existence and how they got to us. There is a reason that, for the most part, we do not have a grimoire that is from the belief standpoint of the Norse. And that's because the way in which they interacted was not one in which they wrote things down. It's also pretty early, right? So maybe if there was, things just haven't survived. But for the most part, that was not their world. So that is not how their magic chose to arise. And I do think that these things have agency in some way. So to deny the agency of how these things came to us in some way is disingenuous to their particular spiritual ecosystem. And I really hope that this doesn't come off as gatekeeping in any way, but if you do have a genuine problem with Christianity and with Catholicism, you are going to be hugely frustrated by a lot of the grimoires that have been translated to this day. It's tough. Yes, God is mentioned all the time. A lot of the prayers, they're Christian. There's going to be a litany to the saints sometimes. It's there. Very few of these things do not have, at least very few of the historic ones that are going up to like the 19th century. They're going to have the Christian elements there because that was their world. I'm not here to poo-poo any kind of neo-pagan reconstruction grimoires. They're not really my jam, but they might be useful to you. Give them a shot. But can one pagan up like old grimoires? If you study enough grimoires and you see the pieces and how they're supposed to work, can you, in some way, make them fit the kind of belief structure that you want? I'd say give it a shot. Create your own grimoire. And I'm not being flippant in saying this. It's much easier than you think once you know how a grimoire looks in the process of evocation, perhaps, or theurgy. But yeah, you just grab yourself, say something like the Heptameron as a guideline, and then see what happens. You never know. But particularly, I think that the process and how it arose and how it works, because it has those Christian and Catholic elements to them. That is how that work and that process and that particular form of magic chose to manifest. Something else which I think people might want to know is this whole idea of magical orders. Yes, MacGregor Mathers, he did start his own magical order. Aleister Crowley did his own Ars Goetia. He was part of and formed a few magical orders of his own. A lot of people that promulgate grimoires and Solomonic magic these days are part of magical orders. Cool. That's up to them. That is a personal choice. I don't do the magical order thing. And here's the answer. You do not need to be in a magical order to do this stuff. And some people might say, well, this seems pretty heavy, this whole evocation of infernal spirits and even angels and stuff like that. Doesn't sound like the safest thing in the world. Perhaps it might be more safe to do it with others. And to that, I say, perhaps, if that works for you. But I tend to think that this kind of thing, for the most part, is done better on one's own. And yet again, I'm going to bring up a quote from one of my favorite people alive right now by the name of Jake Stratton Kent. He has this to say: "Some say that my methods, which I see little sign they fully understand, are not entirely safe. To this, I would be the first to agree. They are not safe because they are not a placebo or a static acceptance of our tradition's current limitations. The magician who avoids burning their fingers does not progress personally, still less advance the art for future generations. Magic is not a no-risk vocation. To encourage this avoidance in others is at best futile and at worst a betrayal. Understand me well. I have very little respect for the majority of magical orders, let alone grades, titles, aprons, and collars. Initiation into these is more of an encumbrance than an advantage. Real magic, so to speak, is not on the square, but in the circle." I absolutely love that. But this also leads one to the idea, and it's something that gets talked up. It seems to come in waves, but there's always this idea, but what about initiation? But what about it? This is what Jake has to say about that. "Most Western magical groups are presently in no position to offer any such meaningful adventure. As a result, the much disparaged term self-initiation has more value and meaning in this context. That initiation has certain typical features, Immersion in the work from a relatively young age, often attended by lack of discrimination but also the ability to absorb information and learn from experience. Madness or other disasters may threaten, even destroy, the unprepared magician who loses the golden thread. However, as a notorious magician once said, an initiatory ordeal that has no risk of failure is not an ordeal. Survival, on the other hand, brings real knowledge and power as the magicians disencumber themselves of useless or unhelpful learning, while retaining whatever has proven itself valuable. This, in the near absence of authentic Western mystery schools and the presence of so many pretenders, is the true path of initiation offered the modern magician. I'm just gonna leave that there. So with evoking Jake's name, if you'll excuse the pun, but I'm all about puns, you know me, I'm going to want to bring up a few individuals that if this kind of thing, grimoires, are something you want to get into and you want to find it fun just like I do, you kind of need to know these folks. And it has been mentioned that grimoire magic and Solomonic magic, it's a bit of a sausage party. It certainly is. And I don't say that to diminish any work that anybody is doing. This is all great stuff. So these people, you need to know them. The first was the person I just mentioned. That is Jake Stratton Kent. I really hope Jake's doing okay. He had a medical emergency not too long ago. I'm doing this episode in 2022. I really hope that Jake is doing okay. But Jake has written the Encyclopedia Goetica. That is 3 books. First is The True Grimoire, which is a translation of the Grimorium Verum. Very cool. Also some notes in there about the Grimorium Verum as well as Goetia in there. Really cool. Geosophia as well as the Testament of Cyprian the Mage. You gotta read those. I would suggest maybe having a familiarity with grimoires before you get into that. I also brought up the fact that he wrote the Sworn and Sacred Grimoire, which if you're beginning is worth a read. I would definitely give it a read, as well as Pandemonium, about spirit lists and these infernal spirits that seem to pop up in tons of grimoires. You need to know who Jake is. He has plenty to say about Goetia and grimoires. Wonderful. I really think that Jake's work is pretty much some of the best that is around right now as far as this kind of thing is concerned. Please seek him out and everything that he does. It's top notch. Another name that you need to know, I've brought him up a couple of times in this episode, is Joseph H. Peterson. He has a website called Esoteric Archives, otherwise known as the Twilight Grotto. My goodness, this website has so many grimoires that you can read for free. They're free. It's on the internet. You do not need to go out and buy those books that are just on a black background with white writing. Please do not buy those grimoires. And I'm not going to mention who puts those out. Don't buy them. Most of these things, they're available online and you can read them for free, and most of them are available on esotericarchives.com. Joseph H. Peterson, my goodness, his introductions in every translated grimoire, they're fantastic. He does some of the best work right now, and I could gush over the variety of grimoires that he's put out and just the exceptional work he does. You need to know who Joseph H. Peterson is. One of the best. Bless his boots. He is, anyways, yes, I'm a huge fan. His grimoires, they're fantastic. They have, a lot of them have, on one page, they'll have the Latin or the original language that the grimoire was written in. And then on the page that's opposite it, it will have the English, full English modern translation there. Really fun. Very cool. Top notch all around. I have not been disappointed with anything that Joseph has put out. So great. But again, if you want some of these grimoires, you don't have to pay for them. He's got them up on his website for the most part. Most of the big ones are there. I'll just say that. If you don't know JHP, you don't know grimoires in this day and age, and I love what he does. Another person you need to know, also brought up on this episode, is Dr. Stephen Skinner. With him and David Rankine, they have produced what is called Sourceworks of Ceremonial Magic. I believe as of October of 2022, there are 12 volumes of these. They're exceptional. Stephen has translated many grimoires, and he's also just released them under Golden Horde Publishing, which is his publishing company. So many great grimoires. Stephen's work is exemplary as well, and he's produced what is maybe one of my favorite things basically produced in the last 20 years in magic, which is Techniques of Solomonic Magic. It is worth picking up. The history that is in that book is basically, hey, you want the history of Western ritual magic? Here it is. And it's as plain as can be. It is really quite wonderful. But Stephen, I can't say enough about him either. So great. I will have a link to a lot of his books in the show notes for this one. Stephen is just a great resource, not only because of the fact that he's an academic, but he's also a practitioner. So he has that knowledge as well. And he's been around for a very long period of time and knows what he's talking about. So he can bring that academic knowledge as well as the knowledge of being a practitioner still to this day. And he can combine that. And so his input, as well as his translations and his knowledge about these sorts of things, is second to none. There is nobody on earth doing what Stephen does. It makes him utterly unique. His insights are beyond valuable. So yes, you have to know the work of Dr. Stephen Skinner, as well as the source works of ceremonial magic, because there's a ton of grimoires in there. And I'll talk about a few of those in just a little bit here. Remember the hook. That's the hook. That's the hook for this episode, the recommended books. But yes, Stephen's work with David Rankine is exceptional. Their translations, they're beautiful. That's the word I'll put. They're stunning and beautiful. The introductions are great as well. But yes, Stephen and David, excellent. You should know both of those guys because they're wonderful. And David is a practitioner, academic in his own sense. Also worth looking into all of David's books as well. But the combination, the duo, the dynamic duo that is Dr. Stephen Skinner and David Rankine, amazing. One final person that I'm going to talk about here is Daniel Harms. Daniel is not a magic practitioner. He's a librarian in his day job, and he has produced many grimoires. Well, translated many grimoires, but he also has a website called Papers Falling from an Attic Window, which is now shifted over to Medium. I will have show notes to both of those links. Check them out, because he also reviews grimoires as they're being released. So the things that are being translated, particularly Stephen's translations and Joseph's translations, but also other people's translations, he does a review of them, and his context and way of looking at them is fairly unique to him, but he also says, like, is this worth having in a magician's collections? And he'll be perfectly straight, and I have never been steered wrong by anything that Daniel has recommended, but Daniel's translations, amazing, fantastic. Please seek them out, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them in a little bit. Yes, Daniel does great work. So those are the big ones in my opinion. There's many other people. I can't list everybody that you should be paying attention to, but those are, in my opinion, the big ones, and they're just the absolute best. All right, so the moment that each and every one of you, I know, has been waiting for, and so this is going to be what I'm going to call the Self-Directed Teach Yourself in 8 Grimoires course. So, right up front, I'm going to say I am not an expert in grimoires. I know a lot about them, but I would never be like one of those people that says, yeah, sure, I know as much about grimoires as those other folks that I've just mentioned. I am not going to do that, but I have read a lot of these things, and I have taken a lot of notes the way that I told you that I took notes earlier. I've gone through these things, pored over them for hours and hours and hours of my life. It is a huge part of what I do magically and my understandings of magic in general. So, with all of that said, I have put a list together that I would like people, if, again, this is interesting to you, this is what you want to get into, that you should go through these from 1 to 8 in the order that I have prescribed. And hopefully, if you do the thing that I mentioned earlier with the note-taking, you are basically set up to be able to talk about grimoires with a bit more of an understanding, or to be able to begin to put these things into your magic and maybe even work one of these books. If not, all of these books, if you should so desire. And with that, I am going to mention the grimoire. I'm going to mention where you should buy it from or who you should get it from. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the grimoire, just a little bit. I can't go too in depth about each and every one of them, but I'll just give you a reason as to why I think it's in the place where I have it. Just a little caveat here that these are not my favorite grimoires. This is not like Doug's top 8 grimoires. Some of them are in there. But my favorite grimoire is actually in the number 4 spot. So I'm just saying this because I don't want people to be like, Doug, you talked about your favorite grimoires. And like, no, that's not my favorite. I like it. There's a reason that I think it's important. I haven't done the work from a lot of these, truthfully, but I have pored over them and I've taken a lot of notes about these guys. So yes, I would say stick to the order and listen to what I have to say about why I think they're important. By the time you get to number 8, you'll be well set up to be able to dissect and take apart these things with the best of them. All right, so shall we get started? The first grimoire that I want you to pay attention to and start to dissect is called the Heptameron, also known as Magical Elements. And I would highly recommend getting the version that is in the 4th book of Occult Philosophy, put out by Dr. Stephen Skinner through Ibis Press. And there's a reason, and I'll circle back to why the Heptameron, but there's a reason I recommend this, because the 4th book of Occult Philosophy, although probably not written by Agrippa, it has a lot of stuff in there. So it has that essay I was talking about earlier on magical ceremonies, which is very, very cool. But it also has the Heptameron, which is the first grimoire I think people should pore over. There is also the Arbitel, which is another grimoire that is included in the 4th book of Occult Philosophy. This is considered by many people to be the very first grimoire that somebody should, quote, work or interact with. While I don't necessarily agree with that, I think that perhaps the Heptameron should be the very first one. Yeah, the Arbitel is an interesting one. I don't have too much time to talk about it, so I'm just not going to. But the Heptameron itself, probably early 16th century, probably not written by the person it is attributed to, which would be Peter de Albano. I don't really want to get into it. Moving along. Why is it a great grimoire to start with is because, well, one, it's pretty much a complete grammar. Almost everything that you need is in there as far as being able to get the grimoire working. It deals with spirits of the air or angels, and they are attributed to the days of the week. And there is a circle in there that changes with the day and season in which you want to be doing the working, and specifically who you are attempting to engage with or evoke. Very cool stuff, I'd say. And something that I just realized now as I'm recording this is that I haven't really done a lot of talking about circles. When I'm talking about circles, those are circles that one draws on the floor that protects you. Don't worry about it. I will be touching on circles in an episode very soon here. But as far as seeing the shape of a grimoire, I can't think of a better example of something so well contained. It is, in my opinion, the best example of what we're going to call a grimoire grammar. So when you're doing notes for this one, it's fairly easy. Things are kind of in interesting places, but this allows you to take those jigsaw puzzle pieces and put them where you need to be able to see how one can actually interact with this very cool grimoire. And as far as some other things that are very interesting about this grimoire, it can, if you look at it historically, spin out in a bunch of really interesting directions. As mentioned in my episode about Goetia, the Ars Goetia takes a lot from the Heptameron. There are parallels with the Key of Solomon. There are close parallels with another grimoire, the Sworn Book of Honorius or Liber Juratus, the planetary invocations in the Heptameron, as well as the planetary invocations in the Munich Manual, the CLM 849 thing that I was talking about earlier. They seem to have the same origin. There's also a connection to Sefer Raziel's. And there's also something kind of contemporary happening right now with the release of The Elucidation of Necromancy by Joseph H. Peterson. I don't want to confuse people too much. I will be talking about this specific grimoire or series of documents in an episode that's going to be coming up fairly shortly as well. But yes, the Heptameron's got a new fire kindled right now, and we'll get into it in due time. But as far as a grimoire to start taking apart, there is nothing better than starting with the Heptameron. They're angels or spirits of the air for the most part, aerial spirits or whatever you want to call them. So it's not too nefarious if you're worried about that sort of thing. And truthfully, the language in the Heptameron is actually kind of joyous. It's kind of like, you've come, brilliant. Let's all get together. We'll have a party. So I think that's pretty. It's cute. It's cheerful. It's wonderful. Accept no substitute. And please, everybody, start with the Heptameron. Get yourself the 4th book of occult philosophy. Or you could just go to esotericarchives.com and it's there. It's free. Joseph H. Peterson's got it up there. Give it a read. I should have mentioned this earlier. My first 3 picks, they're actually, if you want to buy them, they're pretty cheap. You're not going to break the bank by purchasing the first 3 in this 8-list grimoire that I've got here. And again, the Heptameron, it's free. It's up on Joseph H. Peterson's website. Grimoires, for the most part, and this is no shade to anybody producing or translating them, they can get kind of expensive, but a lot of work was put into them. And so I do feel it's important to support these translators because I want to see more of these, right? And hopefully you do too. So pick number 1 was the Heptameron, or Magical Elements. Great place to start. My second pick might be controversial, but I have my reasons. So, after you've picked apart the Heptameron, you should grab True Black Magic, otherwise known as La Véritable Magie Noire. Ooh, you like my French there? Pretty good, huh? Edited, translated, and published by Joseph H. Peterson in 2017. It is quite easy to get a hold of, very affordable grimoire. Do not be turned away by the name, black magic, whatever, etc., etc. But the thing that I find very interesting about this text is that it is an example of a clavicula or a key of Solomon. So yes, it is a variation of a clavicula, but it is also a bibliothèque bleue, as I was talking about earlier. So it's kind of both things. I think a lot of people, they kind of poo-poo the whole bibliothèque bleue thing, but I find them incredibly fascinating. And so some people might be like, well, why don't you just suggest reading the Key of Solomon? And truthfully, one certainly could, but most of the free versions of the Key of Solomon, they're going to be off of Mathers's translation. So they're not going to have a lot of stuff that is in True Black Magic. And while True Black Magic is certainly derivative of the Key of Solomon, I think that this one is worth it for the introduction that Joseph H. Peterson has done alone. So remember what I said about reading the introduction and then reading it again. This is a really good one to start with. And you don't have to be familiar with the clavicula quite yet, but after you read this one, you'll be like, oh, okay, I understand why this is classified as a Key of Solomon. What's interesting about the book also is that it certainly has had its influences on another, say, kind or type of grimoire, which would be the books of Saint Cyprian or Libro di San Cipriano, which are awesome and cool in their own right. So yes, second book, grab yourself a variant of the Key of Solomon, and then perhaps later on, when you've gone through all 8 of these grimoires, you can circle back to the Key of Solomon. Get yourself the veritable Key of Solomon, which was released by Stephen Skinner and David Rankine. But I say I like this one. It's short. It's a little chapbook version of a clavicula. It's quite fun. And who doesn't want to have a book called True Black Magic on their bookshelf? Number 3 is a grimoire that I have talked about quite a bit on this episode, and that is Secrets of Solomon, edited and translated and released by Joseph H. Peterson as well. The history of this grimoire is super cool. I love it. It goes against this idea also that only rich people had these books. They didn't. The history of this grimoire is worth purchasing the book alone, and it's very affordable as well. But it's a witch's handbook from the trial records of the Venetian Inquisition. I'm obsessed with Venice. I absolutely love Venice. It's one of these places that I have to go, and it is so important to the history of Western ritual magic. But man, this book, super cool. Just like True Black Magic, Joseph H. Peterson does a fantastic job in the introduction to this book. It pretty much lays everything out for you, so not a ton of note-taking, but this one, as mentioned earlier, it says in the title of this, it is a clavicula. It's not. It seems to have, or be, the ancestor or prototype of another grimoire called the Grimorium Verum, which is a staggering grimoire in and of itself. The spirits in this one, and it is very spirit-based, this grimoire, seem to be of the more chthonic side, so kind of underworldish. I'm going to say more demonic, but the main reason that I suggest this grimoire is that with the introduction, as well as through your reading of the document itself, you can piece together how a process can be used to basically interact with the spirits that are in the grimoire. It is a little bit tricksy, but these grimoires tend to be, but I know you can do it, and if you've gone through the previous two, like the Heptameron and True Black Magic, this one will present a little bit of a challenge, but it's not too difficult, not compared to some of the things that are coming up. I love this book. I think that the history is awesome and crazy, and it's a heck of a grimoire. And I'll also say this in support of this grimoire is that we all have these ideas that these grimoires have to be this. I hate the term high magic. I really, really do. But this one, it's pretty, I'm going to use the term witchy. It's pretty down to earth, which I think makes its appeal much more broad than a lot of other grimoires. All right, so that was number 3, and I've been ramping up the difficulty as we go along. So pick number 4 is, I'm just going to say, pretty much my favorite grimoire or magical document. It is called the Magical Treatise of Solomon, or the Hygromantia, also pronounced the Hygromantia. I just call it the Hygromantia. It is published by Golden Horde, so that is Stephen Skinner. It is part of the source works of ceremonial magic, edited and translated by Ioannis Marathakis, with an introduction by Stephen Skinner. I have so much to say about this document, and in fact, I have done a full Patreon episode about it. It is very cool. I love it because it is the proto-key of Solomon. It is a proto-clavicula, and you can see pretty much almost all of the elements in what makes a clavicula here. One of the things that is kind of crazy about it is that it is hyper specific as far as its timings are concerned. Some people are like, it's too specific, but I like that precision. It's particularly for my ritual magic. This is the link, I will say, the link between that kind of amazing Byzantine Solomonike magic that we had there in the East, and how that will eventually get morphed and evolve into what will be the Key of Solomon and European ritual magic. If you want Indiana Jones-like grimoire, archaeology and history and crazy awesomeness all rolled into one, the Hygromantia is it. I adore this book. And if you should buy it, it is cool because it is a collection of, well, quite a few manuscripts, so quite a few documents. And so they're kind of all put into the one purchasable Hygromantia or Magical Treatise of Solomon. So it allows you to see, okay, so this is the same as this manuscript, and this is the same as that manuscript, but this thing has something that this other manuscript doesn't have. So when one is taking this one apart, it is going to require you to do quite a bit of note-taking. And this will be where, for you, the rubber hits the road, because one can write so much about these documents and what they tell you to do for how their evocatory structure is and the process as well as the timings. The influence of these documents are unparalleled within the world of magic. I do not say this lightly, but the Hygromantia is, in my opinion, the most important grimoire that we have. It might not be the most influential throughout time, but I still think it is the most important. Nothing comes close. But I will repeat this, taking this one apart is going to be a little bit more work. It does repeat itself because, again, it is just not one manuscript, but several manuscripts. But it's cool that you can see them all and you can see the variation and you can see that some have things that the others do not have. And some have they say that they have the things and then they're like ripped out. The translator just says, and this is missing. So this one is not set out like some of the earlier grimoires. It's not as easy to decipher a working process for using it. But it is there, and one can. It's just going to take some work from you. All right, that's halfway through. We got 4 down, 4 more to go. The 5th grimoire I am going to talk about is the Sworn Book of Honorius, or Liber Juratus. Yet another historically very relevant and hugely influential text. You can grab a copy. It is put out by Ibis Press, edited and translated, as well as has a commentary by, who else? Joseph H. Peterson. As mentioned, the legacy of this grimoire is vast. The story of how it came to be within the grimoire itself is fairly cool. It is the greatest magical knowledge all put into one place and then kept secret by a group of students so that churchmen who were being controlled by demons wouldn't get their hands on it. I mean, that's an awesome story and a movie in and of itself. What's cool about this one is that it's a little bit different than some of the other grimoires that I've already put up, and it's about trying to make yourself holy and to be of true faith so that one can undertake the work within the grimoire. It contains what is called the Visio Die, which is a process in which one can make themselves holy and do the magical work in an ambition to have a vision of God. So it's a bit like, I know everybody loves the whole conversation with the holy guardian angel kind of stuff. This takes less time. So it has that going for it. And it also includes the magical symbol that everybody loves, which is the seal of the true and living God, otherwise known as the Sigillum Diemeth from Dr. John Dee. If you are interested in magic, no doubt you have seen this seal. It is cool. It's in, every time that there's a movie and it's like, oh, there's a sorcerer, that seal is going to be there. You know which one I'm talking about. Anyways, it comes from the Sworn Book of Honorius. The reason I have it as number 5 is that even though it is somewhat easy to take apart, it is pretty big. It's a big one. And so that's going to be a little bit of an endurance test for you as far as doing the note-taking for this grimoire. Lots of angels. John Dee had a copy and loved it. Lots of prayers in this one. Do not be alarmed. But this is a great example of a grammar of magic. It is a complete system in one grimoire, and it's fairly easy to follow. It's just very big. But as far as a cool backstory that one can get into, and as far as its influence, it is a grimoire that everybody should know, and everybody should at least look at and take apart, if grimoires are interesting to you. Grimoire number 6 is Sefer Radziel Liber Solomonis. More angels in this one. I'm going to refer to it as Liber Radziel because one could, as I did when I had a conversation with the one and only Dr. Justin Sledge, for confusing it with another document, much earlier document called Sefer Radziel Hamelach. Yep, that was me coming off like a complete magical noob yet again in front of one of my peers. Classic. Moving on, it is available for purchase. It is released by Golden Horde, edited by both Don Carr and Dr. Steven Skinner. But there is a Sefer Ratziel that is also available for free at esotericarchives.com from Joseph H. Peterson as well. Although he is using a different manuscript than the one that Don Carr and Steven Skinner use. Now, this one is going to be a bit more complex for people because it is written quite differently from all of the grimoires that I have mentioned up to this point. It reads almost like a bit of a story. There's a lot of Solomon said this and Solomon said that. So to crack it and try and take it apart is going to require a lot more study and a lot more note taking. It is divided up into about 7 treatises, and these include things like astronomy and the stars, stones, herbs and animals, incense and suffumigations, timing of day and night, abstinence and purity, the names of heaven and the angels, as well as some virtues and miracles, which is like magical shit, cool magical shit. As mentioned, this one will be a bit of a puzzle because even though it seems to be somewhat organized, there's going to be you trying to pick out the proper information and how to utilize it. And what's cool about the book is that with you engaging with the book and doing your own notes and note-taking, and not just the note-taking about the grimoire, but the actual working through the grimoire, it's kind of weird and meta. It's you being able to work with the book to create a book that allows you to interact with the book. It's strange, and I know that might not make very much sense, but if you start to go through this grimoire, it will make sense eventually. I believe there is an essay in a book put out by Penn State University Press called Invoking Angels. Inside that book, there is an essay called Uplifting Souls by Sophie Page, and it talks about Liber Razialis in there as well. But yes, the note-taking for this one is going to be pretty vast. But do not be discouraged. I know you can do it. Grimoire number 7. A Cunning Man's Grimoire, also known as The Secret of Secrets. So remember how I said, the grimoires that we tend to gravitate and concentrate on have a set methodology for doing a specific thing. Like the Sworn Book of Honorius, you're supposed to do something very specific there. The Key of Solomon, you're supposed to do something somewhat specific, and there's a methodology to it. Well, sometimes some grimoires just have a ton of shit in them. They are a magical miscellany. And there is no better example of this, in my opinion, than A Cunning Man's Grimoire, put out by Golden Horde once again. So that is translated and edited by Dr. Steven Skinner and David Rankine. So there's a little bit of everything in here. Lots of astrology. Do not be discouraged if astrology is not your thing, but you should know about it. There are parts about trying to summon certain spirits, angels, lunar mansions or the mansions of the moon are in there. This one is all over the place, but what you can get are a lot of things that could perhaps augment and help your magic. There is a whole schwack of magical miscellanea in this one. But do not be discouraged by the fact that you're not looking at a specific process. You are looking at a cunning man's workbook. You are looking at a process of everything that mattered to this person. And it is quite staggering, truthfully. You're going to be taking a lot of notes for this one as well, but some of the stuff in there, particularly some of the planetary angelic stuff, is very cool. Those have a bit of a sequence in them, and that is stuff that I would highly recommend you bring into your practice if it is interesting to you. It is just a partial translation, so some of the language in it might be a little bit rough. It might take a little bit of work. Again, take breaks if you need to, if it starts to get a bit overwhelming. There's also some interesting stuff that there's these commentaries from the copyists, and particularly with some of the spirit conjurations that it's almost like the copyist is second guessing themselves. They're like, should I be doing, as a good Christian, should I be doing these things? I'm not really sure, but that is pretty awesome, I think. But just like the earlier grimoire, this one will probably take some work for you to be able to make appropriate notes and to try and figure out if indeed there is something workable in this book. But there is. I've tried it. It's pretty cool. All right, you've made it through 7 grimoires. Got to keep going. And so the very last grimoire that I have here for the self-directed Teach Yourself in 8 Grimoires course list is back to the beginning, and that is the Book of Oberon. So do you remember when I said at the beginning of this episode to go and take a look at an actual grimoire? That would be Folger BB26. Well, that is the Book of Oberon, the cherry on top of this grimoire sundae. And my goodness, it is an absolute beast. A 16th century Elizabethan book of magic. Holy smokes, there is a lot in here. It is all over the place as well, but it is all incredible. There's a heptameron in here as well. So also in a way, it's back to the very beginning. It is a magical miscellanea. It says that it has a Key of Solomon, but it does not have a Key of Solomon, so that is a complete misnomer as well. Angels, infernal spirits, demons, fairies. Do you like fairies? Well, guess what? There's fairies in the Book of Oberon. It is available for purchase in a beautiful, beautiful book released by Llewellyn, edited and translated by Daniel Harms and Joseph H. Peterson. The illustrations and diagrams are very cool, but what's awesome about them is that if you look at the reproduced diagrams in the purchasable Book of Oberon, go back to that link I had earlier and look at the actual pictures, and they're pretty close, but it's still really amazing to see. You're going to be doing a ton of note-taking for this one. Let me tell you, there is stuff that is going to be unlike anything that you have come across so far in these previous 7 grimoires. The less said about the Book of Oberon, the better. Just come to the grimoire on your own terms with everything that you've learned up to this point and dive into the glorious mess that is the Book of Oberon. And that's it. That's all I have. 8 grimoires. Again, not my favorite. Some of them are. Certainly, I do love the Book of Oberon as well. I'm just going to say it is awesome. But if you get through these 8, chances are you'll be able to tackle almost every other grimoire that is put out and released. Well done. You did it. So I'm going to wrap up this episode. I've been talking for nearly 2 hours here, and I'm just going to say that the tradition that is the grimoire tradition is not like other traditions, which say something like Haitian Vodou, which is alive and well, and it's exuberant, and it is still going on, and it bubbles with an intensity unlike other traditions. The grimoire tradition is very different. And I'm going to give a word here to Dr. Stephen Skinner, who has this to say about the grimoire tradition. The history of magic in Europe, therefore, has more often been one of rediscovery, each magician assembling techniques from the books and manuscripts of previous practitioners rather than direct oral tradition. Under these circumstances, it is remarkable that there is such a degree of commonality. I just love that. And that is something that you need to always remember when you're going through these astonishing artifacts. By the very act of trying what is in them and figuring it out, and copying it down and making notes, you are carrying it forward. So share some stories, write a book, make your own grimoire. The creation of procedures and protocol for spirit interaction is what makes the Western magical tradition what it is. Make it your own and write it down. Who knows where it will go? So that is the episode about how to read grimoires as far as being a practitioner, and I hope that there's a lot to take from this episode. please check out my show notes. There's some amazing stuff there. But also, you have to go to esotericarchives.com. Most of the things that I've been talking about, they're going to be there in some way or another. Joseph H. Peterson has done the world of magic a favor with his tireless work. He is a champion and hero of modern magic. But please head to whatmagicisthis.com and check out all of the show notes there. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you can find a link to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, as well as my Facebook account. I am fairly active on Twitter for the most part, although I have been very busy recently, so I'm not on there as much, but that's just how it goes sometimes. If you like the podcast, please tell a friend, and perhaps they'll tell a friend, and that's how the whole tradition of spreading the love that is What Magic Is This continues. If you enjoy it, also leave me a review. Go to Apple Podcasts or whatever Apple is calling it. iTunes is what I tend to say. I don't even know if iTunes is around anymore. Anyways, please write something about my show. Say that you enjoy it. A couple of sentences is all it takes, because people do read those and they might be like, hey, that sounds interesting. I'll give it a shot. And then I've got a new fan of the podcast. And that makes me very, very happy. Do you think that what I'm doing is somewhat important and you want to support in some way? Well, now you can. I have a Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. My goodness, it is only $7 a month. And trust me, if you like grimoires and this stuff is interesting to you, I talk about grimoires a ton on my Patreon content. I have exclusive audio episodes. I've got videos. I just put out a video about how to use a scrying mirror. People really loved it. And then if you didn't get enough information from that, I did an audio episode about scrying as well, just kind of expanding on the things that I shared in the video. Also on the Patreon, you can submit topics that you'd like to be covered in the podcast. And every once in a while, I will do a poll for those topics themselves and whether or not they're going to be on an upcoming episode of What Magic Is This? That is one of the perks. Also, if you sign up, I give you access to the What Magic Is This Discord server. There's a lot of great people there, including past guests of the show. You can ask us questions. We will answer them for you. It is a lovely, wonderful community. We're doing a Secret Santa this year. What magic is this Secret Santa? It's going to be great. I can't wait to do it. Yes, this is in October of 2022, so that's going to be happening in December. So don't miss it. If you want to be part of the What Magic Is This Secret Santa, one of the patrons is setting it up. It's going to be amazing. But all of those things are available through the Patreon. It's like a whole different show. So if you can't get enough What Magic Is This on this regular main podcast, all I'm asking for is $7 a month. You get some amazing content, and that's my favorite stuff is on the Patreon. I just adore everything that I do there. But yes, best way of supporting me, patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and find any number of the Patreon links there. I would really appreciate it. That is the best way of supporting me. I'll say that again. But if you don't want to do the whole Patreon paying every month thing, I have a PayPal Me account, so you can send me any number of money, $5, $10, $20, $200, $200,000. It all goes to keep this podcast alive. I use it for hosting fees and plugins for recording. It's not cheap doing a podcast, just saying. So any amount helps. I will take anything you got, and I will appreciate it greatly. But also, if you want some What Magic Is This merch, I've got a merch store. Head to whatmagicisthis.com, find the menu there, click on merch, and you can find t-shirts, tote bags, notebooks. You know, that notebook that you're going to write about your grimoire, the Liber, the book? Well, what would be better than a What Magic Is This notebook? Just saying. But I have tons of merch there, and it's all wonderful. I've got about 8 designs up. Some of them were designed by me, some designed by some other folks that love the podcast. It's great. I look great in a What Magic Is This t-shirt. I've got a What Magic Is This tote bag. It's amazing. I don't get a ton of money from them. Not complaining. It's more for show. I buy a lot of my own stuff, but I would just say that if you really want to support the show, buying some merch is great. PayPal's better, but the best is going to Patreon and supporting me there, because you just get more stuff and you get the best stuff. In my opinion, you get the absolute best stuff. But all of that is available at whatmagicisthis.com. And so we must close the book that is How to Read Grimoires. I hope I have given you a lot of information. You might have to listen to this a couple of times, but trust me, you'll be able to do it. And I'm sure you'll find it awesome and fun, and it'll give you a whole different context in which to view the Western magical tradition. I don't know about you, but I was hugely influenced by things like Indiana Jones, where there was this wonderful blending of magic, mystery, and history all combined. The most wonderful thing that happened to me on my magical journey was finding out that these books are real and there is real magic in them. And if you engage with them and do it properly, the results are real. Nothing could be finer. So thank you everybody for listening to this somewhat long, certainly my longest solo episode I've ever done. I really hope you enjoyed it. And that's it for this one. Grab yourself some grimoires. Please purchase them. These people do wonderful work. These translators deserve your support. And come on back to What Magic Is This, where we're going to be talking about more of this wonderful, arcane, crazy, interesting stuff that we like to call magic and the occult. Until next time, I want you to stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. We will talk at you soon. Goodbye, everybody. Ta-ta.